The Honourable Member for South Surrey, White Rock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Leader of the Opposition for this motion that calls on the Prime Minister to listen to the calls of the Premiers to talk about the carbon tax. After 8 years of this NDP-Liberal government, food bank usage is at record highs. Young people can't afford to buy homes. Canadians can't afford to put food on the table. Gas is over $2 a litre in British Columbia. Despite the Liberal media misinformation, this is a direct result of the failed carbon tax and a $1.2 trillion national debt. In fact, this is the policy intention of this tax, and Canadians are hurting because of it. But the Prime Minister isn't listening and doesn't care. Instead, he chose to hike the carbon tax by 23% on April 1st. Worse, he plans to quadruple it by 2030. Wow, this is not sustainable. The Premiers of Saskatchewan, Alberta, and New Brunswick recently wrote to the Liberal chair of the Finance Committee asking for an opportunity to express their frustrations with the carbon tax and relay the concerns of their citizens who are struggling with rising costs. The Liberal chair, the member for Mississauga East Cooksville, ignored these Premiers and refused to call a meeting. I will take this opportunity to recognize and thank the brave chair of the Government Operations Committee, my colleague from Edmonton West, who demonstrated principled leadership. He convened meetings at Government Operations so the committee, and by extension Canadians, could hear from these Premiers directly. Sadly, their concerns fell on deaf Liberal ears. The Premiers of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Saskatchewan, Alberta, Ontario, and even the Liberal Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador have written to the Prime Minister demanding a meeting to address carbon tax issues. They understand an urgency that this Prime Minister ignores. Last week, the Leader of the Opposition also wrote to the Prime Minister, echoing the demands of the Premiers, asking for an emergency meeting to hear from them directly. What was the Prime Minister's response? We had a meeting in 2016. 2016! That's an absolutely pathetic response. None of the Premiers he met with in 2016 are even in office today. None of them. Here's the reality. The NDP-Liberal carbon tax is a scam. It's nothing more than a tax plan, disingenuously disguised as an environmental plan. It's a behavioral science tool designed to control people's behavior, not reduce emissions. In fact, it hasn't reduced emissions, but continues to punish Canadian families for the crime of buying groceries and filling up at the pump. The Parliamentary Budget Officer confirmed as much, saying, quote, most households will see a net loss, end quote. To put it simply, the carbon tax is just like the Prime Minister, a failure and not worth the cost. Skyrocketing food prices have resulted in record food bank usage, including in my community of South Surrey White Rock. It was recently reported that more than 1,000 residents are now using the South Surrey Food Bank every week. That's a 35% increase. The Guru Nanak Food Bank that operates in both Surrey and Delta and is not even included in the BC Food Bank statistics is now helping support 3 times more families than in 2020 when it opened. They even have a special section for international students, Mr. Speaker. Food banks in my community are also dealing with a significant shortage in donations, raising concerns that they may not be able to accommodate the increase in demand. This is heartbreaking, but it is the reality after 8 years, despite what this government would have us believe. The carbon tax is not popular. In fact, there is only one provincial party that is enthusiastically embracing the carbon tax, and that's the BC's NDP. Main Street Research recently put this question to British Columbians. When it comes to the carbon tax dispute between the federal Conservative leader and David Eby, who do you agree with? 54% of respondents agreed with our leader and our position. that the carbon tax hike should not be spiked on April 1st. Only 34% of respondents agreed with Premier David Eby. British Columbians are being forced to choose between filling up their cars, heating their homes, or feeding their families. Over 200,000 British Columbians are using the food bank every month. Yet Premier Eby is happily implementing the federally mandated tax grab. On page 75 of the 2024 BC budget, it states, quote, Budget 2023 implemented annual increases to the tax to align with federal requirements. BC's carbon tax is currently at $65 per tonne and will increase every April 1st by $15 per tonne until rates are equal to $170 per tonne in 2030, end quote. He's telling us now BC's carbon tax will increase to comply with the Prime Minister's mandate. According to the Vancouver Sun, BC's carbon tax will raise $9 billion over the next 3 years and only credit back $3.5 billion. Liberal math defies understanding, but that's a $5.5 billion net cost to British Columbians. This brings me back to the motion we're debating today. Whether this NDP-Liberal government can admit it or not, we are in a carbon tax crisis. Despite the opposition of 70% of Canadians and 7 out of 10 premiers, the Prime Minister refused to spike the hike April 1st and instead chose to inflict more pain on Canadians when they can least afford it. When it comes to emissions reductions, the carbon tax has been a demonstrable failure. COP ranks Canada at 62nd out of 67 countries on climate performance. Once again, this NDP-Liberal government doesn't have an environmental plan. They have a tax plan. Provinces need the flexibility to determine what is best in their jurisdictions. Conservatives believe in technology that actually delivers results, like greenlighting green projects, exporting LNG to end Europe's dependence on Russian oil, carbon capture and storage. We don't believe in virtual signaling and taxes that only inflict pain and that is on struggling Canadian families. The reality is this: the carbon tax crisis is the Prime Minister's own making, and his response to the premiers is unacceptable. What is he afraid of? Although we're separated by thousands of kilometers, our citizens are all facing the same grinding issues. For a confederation like ours to work, if there was ever a time to bring people together, it is now. The Prime Minister must call a meeting, sit down with the premiers, and let Canadians into the conversation. After all, this is a Prime Minister that said, and I quote, "Government and its information must be open by default," end quote. Well, now's his chance, his big moment. The Prime Minister needs to do the right thing. He needs to show some courage, sit down with the premiers, who he's never met with before, and end the carbon tax crisis that he created. He needs to do his job, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Here, here.